Picture a small medieval village. An old woman lives alone at the edge of it. Her neighbor's cow stopped giving milk. Someone whispers a word. The word travels from house to house, faster than anyone can stop it. You already know what's supposed to happen next. Torches. A trial with no real defense. A stake in the village square. This is the image burned into all of our heads when we think about witches and the Middle Ages. An entire continent, for 1,000 years, dragging accused women out of their homes and burning them alive by the thousands. Here's what almost nobody knows. For most of the medieval period, the church didn't just fail to hunt witches, it officially banned believing in them. Not practicing witchcraft, believing it was even real in the first place. Say that phrase out loud to most people and watch their face change. The Middle Ages, the era we associate with superstition, ignorance, and religious fanaticism, is exactly the era when church law explicitly told priests to teach their congregations that witches flying through the night sky were nothing more than delusions. Believing the fantasy was the sin. Let's talk about where this myth actually comes from, because it's not coming from medieval court records. It's coming from centuries of movies, novels, and half-remembered history class slideshows that lump the Inquisition, witch burnings, and the Dark Ages into one single, blurry, torchlit image. Say the word medieval to almost anyone, and the image that pops into their head is candlelit courtrooms, black-robed inquisitors, and screaming women being dragged to the stake. So here's the actual question we need to answer. When did the witch hunts really happen? Who was actually doing the hunting? And does any of it line up with what historians actually call the Middle Ages? Or have we been blaming the wrong century this entire time? Let's start with the document that breaks the whole myth wide open. Around the year 906, a text known as the Canon Episcopi was written into church law, and what it said should completely rearrange how you picture medieval religious authority. The Canon Episcopi stated in plain terms that it was heresy to believe that women flew through the night sky riding alongside pagan goddesses. Not heresy to fly through the night sky, heresy to believe that it happened at all. According to this early medieval church document, these stories were delusions, hallucinations, tricks played on the imagination. Anyone who accepted them as literal fact was the one committing a religious error. Sit with that for a second. This is early medieval church law, actively working to talk people out of witch panic, not stoke it. Now, that doesn't mean the early medieval church ignored magic entirely. What it actually went after was something narrower, something almost mundane by comparison. It was called maleficium, concrete, specific, harmful magic. Poisoning a neighbor's well, cursing someone's livestock, causing a specific, identifiable harm through sorcery. This wasn't the image of a vast, organized cult of devil worshippers meeting in the woods at midnight. It was closer to prosecuting someone for a very particular, very local act of alleged sabotage. The organized, continent-wide, devil-worshipping witch cult that we picture when we say the word witch hunt, that idea didn't exist yet. Not in this period. Not even close. So, when did the actual witch hunts happen? Here's the detail that upends everything. The real explosion of witch trials, mass executions, entire regions gripped by panic didn't happen during the Middle Ages at all. It happened between roughly 1550 and 1650. That's after the medieval period had already ended. That's during the Reformation. That's during a century of religious wars tearing Europe apart between Catholics and Protestants. The witch craze that lives in our collective imagination is, historically speaking, an early modern phenomenon, not a medieval one. And there's a very specific reason this shift happened when it did. In 1486, near the very tail end of the medieval period, a book was published called the Malleus Maleficarum, the Hammer of Witches. This book, not some ancient medieval text, is the actual origin point for the modern stereotype of the witch, the demonic pact, the secret coven, the seductive alliance with Satan himself. This wasn't medieval superstition boiling over. It was a specific, late, deliberately engineered piece of propaganda that arrived just as the medieval world was ending, and a new, more violent chapter was about to begin. And when the accusations did start flying in large numbers, they weren't primarily coming from church tribunals hunting down secret covens. They were coming from something far more human and far more local, a neighbor who resented another neighbor, a community gripped by famine searching for someone to blame, a village torn apart by war and fear, looking for an explanation for why the crops failed or the children got sick. Secular courts, run by local officials and townspeople, actually condemned accused witches more often than official church courts did. This wasn't some top-down campaign of religious terror descending from Rome. It was, disturbingly often, driven by the people right next door. Here's the twist that should genuinely mess with your sense of history. For most of what we call the Middle Ages, if a priest stood up in front of his congregation and preached that witches were real, that they flew through the night sky on the backs of animals, that they gathered with pagan spirits under the moon, that priest wasn't defending church doctrine. He was breaking it. Preaching that witches were literally real made him technically a heretic himself. Flip that around in your head for a second. We think of the medieval church as the institution obsessed with witches, feeding the fear, lighting the fires. And for centuries, the actual official position was the opposite. The fantasy itself was the problem. Believing too hard in witches got you in more trouble than not believing in them at all. And here's where the timeline in most people's heads gets flipped completely upside down. We assume superstition worked like a slow fade. Wild, irrational belief dominating the dark medieval centuries, gradually burning off as humanity crawled toward the Enlightenment. That's not what happened. The official belief in witches as a real, organized demonic threat didn't fade out toward the end of the Middle Ages. It intensified after the Middle Ages had already ended. Let's look at what the actual documents say, because this isn't speculation. This is written into church law. Around the year 906, the canon episcopi laid out its position clearly. Women who claimed or were rumored to ride out at night in the company of the goddess Diana were not doing anything real. According to this text, these were illusions, tricks conjured by the devil to deceive the mind, not events actually happening in the physical world. And crucially, the text goes further than simply dismissing the stories. It says believing those stories were literally true was itself a spiritual failure, bordering on heresy. This wasn't a fringe opinion either. This attitude held for centuries. In the 15th century, you get figures like Antonino of Florence, an archbishop, actively instructing people to confess and repent, specifically for holding common beliefs about witches. Not repent for practicing witchcraft, repent for believing the folklore in the first place. A senior church official telling his own congregation that their superstition was the actual sin. Now, lay the timeline out in order, because the sequence tells the whole story on its own. Canon Episcopi, roughly 906. Centuries of church-endorsed skepticism following it, treating witch stories as folk delusion rather than fact. Then, in 1486, the Malleus Maleficarum arrives, right at the tail end of the medieval period, flipping centuries of official skepticism completely on its head. And only after that, between 1550 and 1650, do the actual mass trials and executions explode across Europe. Notice what that timeline actually shows. The panic didn't build gradually across the medieval centuries and finally boil over. It sat dormant, actively suppressed by church doctrine for over 500 years, and then detonated almost entirely after the Middle Ages were already over. So why do we keep squeezing 1,000 years of history into one single blurry image of torches and superstition? Part of the answer is that the Middle Ages is a terrible label. It covers roughly 1,000 years, dozens of kingdoms, and enormous shifts in law, religion, and daily life, and we flatten all of it into a single mental snapshot. One era, one vibe, dark, ignorant, superstitious, done. It's simply easier to hold one image in your head than to track 5 centuries of actual change. And there's something else going on here too, something a little less innocent. It feels good to draw a hard line between back then and now. It's comforting to imagine that people in the past were simply more gullible, more violent, more prone to mass panic than we are today, because it lets us believe we've climbed out of that. We get to feel like the enlightened ones, looking back at the primitive ones. Except we do the exact same thing today that we're accusing the Middle Ages of doing. We take a moral panic, a stretch of history soaked in fear and bad decisions, and we shove it backward in time, pinning it on the old days, when the truth is it happened far more recently than we'd like to admit. The witch trials are a perfect example. We assume it's an ancient problem, safely locked away in a distant, superstitious past. In reality, the worst of it happened during the Reformation, during religious wars, during a period that overlaps with the invention of the printing press and the early stirrings of modern science. Not some remote, torch-lit dark age, a period a lot closer to our own than we're comfortable admitting. So here's the picture worth actually keeping in your head. The image of medieval Europe, village after village, century after century, burning witches at the stake. That's not really a medieval memory at all. It's a memory borrowed from early modern Europe and quietly backdated onto the Middle Ages, because it fits the story we already wanted to tell about how dark and superstitious that era supposedly was. For most of its actual existence, the medieval church wasn't hunting witches. Officially, on paper, in its own laws, it didn't even believe they were real.